My name is Henry Griffin. I'm here today to present some material that I call Understanding the Cycle of Anger and Addiction. In 1964, I was working with adolescents, and when I was asked to develop a program that would address the relationship between anger and addiction. Thus, over the last 20 plus years, I've continued to develop, teach, and refine this material that I call the cycle of anger and addiction. Aristotle once said, anyone can become angry. That's easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that's not easy. And I think most of us understand that. If we have issues with anger, sometimes we don't get angry with the right person, we don't do it to the right degree, and we don't do it at the right time. 1 minute of anger weakens your immune system from 4 to 5 hours. 1 minute of laughing boosts your immune system for over 24 hours at a time. Being prone to anger is a stronger predictor of heart attack than our high cholesterol, smoking, and high blood pressure. So you can kind of see that being prone to anger has not only some emotional deficits about it, but it also has some physical deficits about it as well. A young therapist once said, if you can't learn to manage your emotions, you'll never learn to be able to manage your drugs. And I think that also means you'll have a difficult time managing your life. Anger is a natural, normal human emotion. The feelings of emotions are neither good or bad, but it's the expression of emotions that determines whether or not there'll be positive or negative outcomes. The feeling of anger is a reaction. It's a reflex. Whenever you become angry, it is just natural, it is just normal, and it's human to feel angry. There's nothing wrong with the feeling of anger, and we're not going to talk about how to do away with anger. We're going to talk more about how to use anger in a positive way. The expression of anger is a response. It's a learned behavior. We're not born expressing our anger in a certain way. It's not biologically wired into us, but how we learn to express our anger is a learned behavior. How an individual chooses to respond to angry situations is a learned behavior based upon individuals' personal belief systems. And the great things about learned behavior is if you've learned an inappropriate or destructive way, you can also learn a positive way. A simple definition of the word cycle is a series of events that are regularly repeated in the same order. Therefore, I begin the cycle of anger and addiction with what I call injustice. Injustice is simply the wrongful violation of a person or person's right, acts or conditions which causes a person to suffer hardship or loss undeservedly. Now understand, all of us understand what injustices are. I've never met anyone that's been on this earth very long that cannot tell me of some sort of injustice that they've experienced in life. A lot of people come into this world before they ever come out of their mother's womb. They have suffered the injustice of addiction and things of that nature. People suffer injustices all the time. The news is filled with people suffering injustices. Not so long ago, there was a hurricane that come through the southern part of the United States. There were thousands of people that were displaced. Their homes were destroyed. Their cars were destroyed. Everything that they had was destroyed. All of that was injustice. They didn't do anything to deserve that to happen. But we live in a world that's filled with injustice. If you watch the news again, people are victims of crime, by the thousands. People are continually being caught up in problems and difficulties. People lose their jobs. People are incarcerated unjustly. All of these things are injustice. And so the cycle of anger and addiction that I talk about deals with the very first step is injustice. And I think everybody can relate to that. The next step in this cycle I call pain. When we suffer an injustice in our life, the very next step that we experience is pain. Literally, it hurts. It physically hurts, it mentally hurts, it spiritually hurts, it emotionally hurts. Pain is the personal experience of frustration, fear, and or hurt produced by an actual or perceived injustice. I mean, this is a very simple concept, and it's a very simple cycle. We have an injustice in our life, and that injustice simply produces pain. Now, it appears that very few people in our society today really knows how to deal with pain. I mean, Americans make up 5% of the world's population, but yet they consume 80% of the prescription painkillers in the entire world. 1 out of every 3 Americans is prescribed some sort of pain medication trying to deal with either a physical pain, a mental pain, emotional pain. Few people seem to know how to deal with it. And so in working with people in the counseling world and in the correctional world, what I have found is that people tend to try to manage their pain in one or a combination of these 3 ways I'm going to talk about. Some, they try to medicate their pain. They try to self-medicate. And we know about these things. These are the people that are addicted to substances. These are the people that try to medicate their pain with alcohol or with some sort of drug, cocaine, methamphetamine, opiates, heroin, morphine, Percocet. I mean, the list goes on and on of all of the drugs that are out there today. I mean, there are so many drugs that, they've now developed synthetics. There's synthetic cocaine, there's synthetic marijuana, there's synthetic opiates, and all of these things are available, and people try to deal with their pain, especially their emotional pain, by trying to self-medicate. Second way that people try to medicate their pain is they motivate it. They become busy. They become distracted. There are a lot of people in our society that because of their emotional pain, they don't know how to deal with it. They don't know what to do with it. They're not individuals that normally or typically use drugs or those kind of medications, but they become busy. They become workaholics. These are people that are consumed by sports. These are people that are consumed by video games. These are people that are consumed by pornography and sexual addictions, and they're shopaholics, sometimes we call them, and they use all kinds of non-chemical sort of things to try to medicate their pain. They are ever busy. When you talk to people today and you ask them how they're doing, they either tell me I'm tired, or they tell me that they're busy. It seems that they're just trying to distract their mind from thinking about or dealing with the things that they feel like that are pain in their life. And so some people medicate, some people motivate, and the third way that people try to deal with this pain is they meditate. Sometimes I call these the wound collectors. These are individuals in life that go through life that have injustices in their life. They never deal with them. They just meditate on them. They just think about them. They just talk to other people about them. They just collect all of these wounds. They never get any help with them. They never go to try to work through them, and they just bury them on the inside. And they think by burying these emotions on the inside that in time they'll go away. There's an old myth that goes a little bit like this: time heals all wounds. I think most of us have heard that myth before, and I call it a myth because time does not heal all wounds, especially emotional wounds. All that time does with emotional wounds is make people bitter. It doesn't make people better. It's hurtful because those emotions that we try to bury, they're not dead. They're still alive. We bury them in our hearts, we bury them in our spirits, and they live there. And if we don't deal with them, and if we don't, do something to, stop the pain and heal the wound, that emotion will just, mutate into something worse than before. And if you don't clean out that pocket in your spirit that holds all of these wounds, what happens is they just compound and compile, and people become worse and worse, and they develop into spiritual problems. They develop into things like bitterness and resentment and unforgiveness. And we'll talk a little bit more about that way of expressing anger in just a little bit. But people either try to medicate or motivate or meditate on their pain. The third step in this cycle, I simply call anger. When you have an injustice that takes place in your life, and you experience pain, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual pain because of that injustice that you've experienced, the very next thing that we feel is anger. And that's a natural, normal human emotion. And that's how it should be. When you have been hurt, when you have been harmed, when you have been done wrong, there is nothing wrong. We are humanly created and made in a way in which that we're going to experience the feeling of pain. Pain is simply the physiological or emotional response produced by actual or perceived injustice. It hurts when something is done to us that we don't deserve, or we perceive that we don't deserve. It happens. Now, there's a big difference in feeling anger and expressing anger. The feeling of anger doesn't get anyone in trouble. It just helps us to recognize that there is something wrong in our lives, that something we're doing or something we're not doing has caused this pain, and we need to do something about it. But it's how that we learn to express this anger that's going to turn into problems. So how do you express your anger? We're going to talk about 4 different ways that I believe that people learn to express their anger. 3 of them are going to be negative. 1 of them is going to be positive. 1 of them is going to be a way that I believe that people can learn how to express their anger in a positive way, or what I call a motivating way to make changes in their life. You see, most anger generally stems from 1 or more of these 3 emotions that we're going to talk about. When I work with people in counseling, and I've worked in corrections for nearly 20 years now, and I've been a licensed counselor for over 25 years, I have found that when people get angry, it generally stems from 1 or a combination of these 3 emotions. Number 1 is fear. You know, they're afraid. And because they become afraid, they get angry because they don't know how to express fear. A lot of times when someone's angry, I'll just simply ask them, what are you afraid of? Why has this situation made you afraid? And you know, many times when they're able to sit down and they're able to think about it a minute, they're always able to come up with an idea of some kind of fear. Another way that people do is when they get hurt. They're feeling hurt. The second question I ask is, how did this situation hurt you? What about this situation caused you to feel that in some way or another you were going to be harmed? And the third thing is what I call frustration, or many times referred to as unrealistic expectations. And the question there is, what was your unrealistic situation about what happened to you? You say, well, give me an example. Okay, let's say we're going down the interstate, and this happens all the time. And we've all experienced this. If we've drove on the expressway, we're going down the expressway, and someone quickly pulls over in the other lane in front of us. And I mean, we automatically get afraid because we're afraid that individual is going to hurt us by hitting our car or running us off the road. And so, you know, the very first response we have is fear. The question is, what are you afraid of? I'm afraid I'm going to wreck. What's the next step? Well, why else did you feel that anger? Because you were afraid you were going to get hurt. You may have had your loved ones in the car with you. And even if not, if it's just you, you don't want to wreck on the interstate. You don't want to get injured. You don't want to die. I mean, you know, so what's your fear? What's your hurt? What was your unrealistic expectation? The unrealistic expectation is that everybody drives safely on the interstate. And we know that's not true. And most of us, again, if we've drove on the interstate, we have accidentally ourselves at some time or another probably pulled over too quickly in front of someone and caused them to feel as though that they were in danger. You see, that sort of situation calls us to feel angry. And that's a natural, normal human emotion. You know, we're afraid. We're afraid we're going to get hurt. And our unrealistic expectations about people get us into trouble with anger all the time. We have these unrealistic expectations that people are perfect, even that we are perfect sometimes, and that we should never make mistakes. But we have to understand that it's unrealistic to believe that people don't make mistakes. It's an unrealistic expectation to believe that life is fair. There's a lot of people who struggle with the idea that I did nothing wrong, but bad things happened to me. I mean, that is just how life is. And it's an unrealistic expectation. So when I work with people and I talk to them about their anger and why they became so angry, I have never met a client yet who could not identify a fear, who could not identify a hurt, and could not identify an unrealistic expectation that was connected to their anger. So we're going to talk about the first way that I believe that people learn to express their anger. They learn to express their anger in what I call a defensive way, or sometimes it's been called a passive aggressive or a passive expression of anger. This kind of anger keeps people from getting too close. It helps you maintain your secrets. It keeps you from getting hurt, but it also keeps you from ever getting any help. The belief system is if you really knew me, you really wouldn't like me. The dominant emotion that's associated with anger used as a defense is hurt. And we've talked about that hurt. And the core characteristic is unforgiveness. Now, a lot of people, they don't like to talk about unforgiveness because they think that's some kind of religious term. But unforgiveness, is not really in the context of religion. It's letting go of the injustices that take place in our life. And when you find someone who expresses their anger in a defensive way, they just hold everybody out in life at arm's length. They walk through life pretty much like this. They never let anybody get close. They don't ever get to know people well. Their relationships tend to be just very surface because they walk around in life in a defensive way. They're afraid to let anybody get into their life because the dominant emotion in their life is hurt. Their belief system is, if I let you get close to me, you're going to hurt me. And because I have all of this unforgiveness, I'm a wound collector. I've collected all of these wounds in my heart. I just cannot afford to allow myself to become vulnerable to let somebody else in my life to hurt me again. Now, most people who express this anger in this way are people who have actually been hurt. But again, who of us have not been hurt? But some of us know better how to deal with that emotional pain than others. I'm going to share with you some characteristics of people that express their anger in a defensive way. And you can just kind of identify yourself whether or not you express anger in this manner of speaking. The first characteristic is you're bitter. Now, for me, bitter just simply means no matter what you've got in this life, you're not happy with it. I mean, when you were driving a 1974 Ford Pinto, you wasn't happy with it. And when you moved up and you got a 1990, Crown Vic, you weren't happy with it. And now you're driving a Mercedes-Benz and you're not happy with it. No matter what you get, in a short period of time, it doesn't make you happy. You're living in a one-bedroom apartment with one bath, and you move into a three-bedroom house with two baths. You're no happier. You were no happier in that one-bedroom home than you are now in this three-bedroom home. You were making $7.50 an hour at a job. You felt you were underpaid. Now you're making $12 an hour. You still think you're underpaid and underappreciated. You're making $50 an hour. It doesn't matter. You're bitter. Why are you bitter? Because you're hurt and you have unforgivenesses in your life. And nothing that you have in this life makes you happy. The second characteristic I call resentments. It's similar to bitterness. Bitterness is not only are you not happy with anything you have, but you're not happy with anything anybody else has. In the correctional setting in which I work, we call this person a hater. This is a person that no matter what somebody else gets, we're not happy for them. We don't think they deserve it. We're always setting in judgment how that you deserve that more than they do. But it's because that you're hurt. It's because you have unforgiveness in your life. It's because that you are bitter, and thus it makes you resentful. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous says, resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stems all forms of spiritual disease. The spiritual disease of resentment. The third characteristic we're going to talk about is lack of trust. You don't trust anybody. You're afraid to let anybody come into your life. Like I said, you hold everybody at arm's length. You have difficulty with trust issues. Sometimes I will have people who will ask me in counseling situations, they'll say, Mr. Griffin, do you trust me? And my response all the way to that question is, do you trust you? And they'll always grin. And my response to that is, why would I trust you when you can't even trust yourself? See, you got to understand, you can't give away what you don't have. You want people to trust you, but you're not willing to trust other people, and you're not willing to trust other people because that you have been hurt and you've got unforgiveness in your life. And so you don't trust people. And not being able to trust has a lot of ramifications in a person's life. It really makes it impossible to have positive relationships. It makes it difficult to have positive relationships with a spouse. Makes it difficult to have positive relationships with a child. It's difficult to have positive relationships with friends because you don't ever fully trust anyone. You're always holding people out at arm's length. Fourth, lack of commitment. Really associated with lack of trust. Because you don't trust anyone and because you're afraid that you're going to get hurt, you really are hesitant to make any kind of commitment to anyone or anything. Probably if you've been hurt in a relationship. I hear a lot of men tell me things like, they just don't make women like my mom. But then again, working with women, I hear them say things like, there's just not any good men out there anymore. And when I hear men and women make comments like that, I know that those comments are coming from deep-seated hurts and unforgiveness in their life. They have been in relationships where they were hurt, where they were offended, and maybe it had happened even more than once, but it doesn't take more than once. I have met folk that just one time hurt them so deeply that it has now colored every relationship that they've ever been in their life, and they have a hard time fully trusting and committing. Not only do people have a problem committing in relationships, but they have problems committing in jobs. I see guys that have lost really good jobs in time gone by. They were making very good money. They had really good benefits, had great working conditions. It was, a very positive place to work, and employment took place. They got laid off. Maybe they got let go because of an injury or an accident or something that really wasn't under their control, what we call an injustice. They lost that job. And now, because they're hurt, they're content upon taking jobs that pay way less than what their skills are. Because the belief system that sets in is, if I lose a $7 an hour job, no big deal. That's not going to hurt. I can get a $7 an hour job anywhere. But they're afraid to commit to something because they're afraid if they commit that they're going to get hurt. Overly sensitive. I mean, people become overly sensitive. Have you ever met people that just seem like no matter what you said to them, even if you were trying to compliment them, they took it the wrong way and their feelings got hurt? People that react that way generally react that way because they have deep-seated roots of hurt and unforgiveness. They're overly sensitive. No matter what you say, it offends them. No matter how you try to appease them, there's no appeasing them. They're just so sensitive. They take everything you say out of context and twist it and turn it in a hurtful manner. You're not trying to hurt them at all. But what they're hearing through their filters of hurt is you're trying to hurt them. And so they have become so sensitive to what people say. And they're easily hurt. I mean, I do this material, I've done this material for 20 years. There's probably been hundreds, even thousands of people that have listened to this material. And a lot of times they sit there and they're just waiting for me to say something negative, something that they can jump on and say, yeah, what you're telling me is just not so. Here's an example, and probably the most dramatic example I've ever personally experienced. In my early counseling career, I worked with sexually abused women. I worked in a hospital in Cincinnati. I did an internship there first. And during my internship, I worked in a group with two other counselors and sat in a group with a group of 10 women there that had been, abused in some manner or another. And back in those days, interns, they just sat in the group. They didn't take notes. They didn't ask questions. They didn't give feedback. They just sat there quietly and observed the process because that's how it was done. And I remember I'd been in this one particular group a couple of times, and it was time to go to group, and the director of that program came to me and said, Mr. Griffin, we can't let you go in that group anymore. And I mean, it surprised me, and to be honestly, it kind of hurt me a little bit because I thought, what did I do wrong? And so I asked the director, I said, what did I do wrong? Did I do something wrong? I don't do anything. I just go in and I sit down and, I don't take any notes and I don't ask any questions and I don't give any feedback. I said, I don't understand. And she looked at me and she said, do you know who you're working with? And I said, yeah, sexually abused women. And she said, well, I don't really have to explain it to you, but I will. She said, there's a woman in the group who has told her primary counselor that you breathe like the man who molested her. And said all that she can think about during the session is that sexual assault because of the way you breathe. Now understand, I've been accused of offending a lot of people in my life for a lot of things I've done and said. But that's the only time in my life that I was ever told that I was offensive because of the way I breathe. But people can be so hurt. And people can be so harmed. And we have to be aware that when people are hurt and harmed, that there's got to be understanding there. I mean, on that particular day, I came to a realization that when people have been deeply hurt, that sometimes the things we say, sometimes the things we do, sometimes the way how that we interact with them can be very hurtful, even though we can't imagine such a thing in our own minds. I call these characteristics of anger STDs. Now, I know some of you are probably laughing at that and thinking, what in the world does this have to do with sexuality? Well, actually nothing. What I mean by STDs is spiritually transmitted diseases. You see, spiritually transmitted diseases, these characteristics, bitterness, resentment, being easily hurt, overly sensitive, lack of trust, lack of commitment. These are all characteristics that are spiritually transmitted from one individual to another. Have you ever met an individual that was bitter or resentful? Did you ever meet their children? Did you ever meet their parents? Oftentimes what you find is that this spiritual resentment, bitterness, not having any trust for anyone, just easily hurt, has been transferred from generation to generation. Years ago, I worked in corrections in Ohio. And at the first institution that I worked there, I was a counselor, and I had a caseload, and every week I would meet with my caseload for an hour for an individual session. And I worked there for about 2 years, and I got transferred to another institution just across the road, and there I was supervisor. And at that institution, I supervised several substance abuse programs. In fact, there's 2 compounds at that institution, an A side and a B side, and we had programs on both sides of the compound. I was sitting in my office one day looking at the list of people that had been admitted to the program over on Zone A. And I noticed a name there of a young man. It said that he was about 19 years old and that he had been admitted to the program on Zone A. His name was one that I've only seen one other time in my entire life, even to this day. And it created a curiosity in me because that other individual had been a client on my caseload at my previous institution. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go over at some point and see this young man because I'm just out of my own curiosity. I want to know if there's some sort of relationship between these 2 individuals. A few weeks went by and I didn't get over there, and one day I received a call from the supervisor on Zone A, and he said, we're getting ready to discharge this young man. Said he is just tearing things up over here. Said he's not compliant with anything. He's being aggressive. He's saying he doesn't want to be in this program. He's giving everyone a hard time, and we feel like we need to discharge him. And I said, I really want to see that young man. And I told the supervisor, I said, don't discharge him today. I said, have him meet me in the morning in my office on Zone A at 8 o'clock. And I said, I want to talk to him. And the supervisor said, okay. And so the next morning, I went to my office on Zone A, and the young man was already there when I came to the building where my office was, and he was walking outside my door. He was pacing backwards and forwards, and you could hear him cursing under his breath, and he was mumbling to himself, and he was obviously upset. And I came in the door, and I said, young man, do you mind coming to my office? And he stomped into my office, and he sat down, and I sat down, and he just immediately began to rant and rave about how the program wasn't any good, and my counselors were not good counselors, and it wasn't helping him, and he said, my daddy, used to beat my mama, and my daddy used to this and that, and all of a sudden, as he started talking about his daddy and his childhood, all of this rage and anger that he had and all of this cursing stopped, and he began to weep, and he began to cry, and he began to apologize. And he said, I'm sorry, Mr. Griffin, trying to talk through his tears and sniffing, and he had puddled up a puddle of tears in the floor, and he was just crying, and he said, I need this program. Said, I need to go home to my wife. I need to go home. I've got a new baby. I need to be there. Don't put me out of the program, please. I need this to be able to go home. And he went back to talking about his dad. And I let him talk a few minutes and gave him tissue to dry his eyes and told him, I said, go wash your face. Go walk out on the yard for about 30 minutes and come back and I'll talk to you some more. Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Thank you. Don't put me out of the program. I said, it'll be all right. I went on the database and I looked up this young man and I looked up his charges. He was there for substance abuse, for alcohol and marijuana. He was there on a domestic violence charge. He had a long history of juvenile detention. And then I pulled up the other man that I had known before for 2 years. For 2 years, I met with that man for an hour a week for 2 years. You know how many times? And I come to discover that this young man, this older man, was his father. Never did that man talk about that young man in 2 years. But the very first time I met that young man, he wanted to talk about his dad. The young man came back to the office and he sat down. He began to apologize again. And I said, I understand. I get it. And he started telling me, I haven't seen my dad in over 10 years. He said, my dad beat my mother. My dad was an alcoholic. My dad was incarcerated, in jail, out of jail, in prison, out of prison. So my dad was an evil man. And I listened to him talk. And I said to the young man, I said, do you really want to get better? And he said, I do, Mr. Griffin, I do, but I don't know how. And I said, well, I'm not going to discharge you from this program, but I'm going to meet with you every Monday morning at 8 o'clock in my office, and you and I are going to talk. And we're going to talk about how to get better. You see, understand, that young man, even though he had not seen his dad in 10 years, was walking as closely in his dad's footsteps as he could have walked if he had seen him every day. That's a spiritual thing, folks. Because of confidentiality, I couldn't tell that young man I knew where his dad was. In fact, he was less than a mile away in the institution across the street. You see, when we express our anger in a defensive way, we open ourselves up to spiritual problems. Second way we express our anger, it can be used to manipulate. Indirect anger expression. It allows you to avoid intimate and respectful relationships. It allows you to wallow in your self-pity. It keeps you in a state of frustration from yourself and others. The belief system is, my situation is hopeless and I just cannot change. Dominant emotion is frustration, unrealistic expectations, and the core characteristic is hardness or callousness, I like to call. I asked people, I said, what do you got to get before you get calluses? And most people know what you get before you get calluses. Before you can ever get calluses, you got to get blisters. In other words, you got to get hurt. That friction of that axe in your hand chopping wood, which I remember doing as a young man, you know, initially you'll get blistered, but in time you'll get calloused. And that's how a lot of people in life is when they get angry and they've had injustices in their life. And you know, it is turned into frustration. They have tried and they've tried and they've tried, and no matter what they've tried, they've not been successful. And because they haven't been successful, they become hard. They become calloused. They begin to believe that there's no help for them, that no matter what they can do. I work in a substance abuse program now, and I've worked in many substance abuse programs over the years. And I can't tell you how many men and women and adolescents that I have met that have been in multiple programs and that didn't work for them. And they come in frustrated. But they also come in hard and callous because most of the time they're mandated those programs. They don't come there as a volunteer. And they don't think it's going to help them because they've tried program A and it didn't work, and they've tried program B and it didn't work, and they tried program C and it didn't work, and what I'm telling them they've heard before and it didn't work, and so they become calloused and they become hard. Here's some of the characteristics of anger that's expressed in a manipulative way or an indirect way. First characteristic is what I call sarcasm. Sarcasm is our jokes that we make about things we're angry about. If you ever listen to men comedians, they make jokes about women and their relationships. If you ever listen to women comedians, they talk about men and the problems in the relationships. We make jokes about things that we are angry about. And we're angry and we don't feel like we can do anything about it. We're frustrated. We don't know what the answer is. Many times we don't even know what the question is anymore. I mean, we just are trying to make it. And so instead of crying and instead of, acting in that way, we just make jokes about it. We just make light of it. We don't take anything seriously. We don't think anything really matters. The second characteristic is rationalizations. We rationalize situations. We give a good answer, but we don't give the real answer. When people ask us questions about things, we have a hard time being honest, because what's the need of being honest? It's not going to matter anyway. And in fact, in times when I have been honest, I've been punished for being honest. So I'm not going to give you the entire truth. If I give you the entire truth, you'll use it against me, to hurt me, to harm me. That's been my experience. They've become calloused. Procrastination. Now, some people say, how is procrastination and anger related? Some procrastination is related to anxiety. The idea that I'm afraid to start because I'm afraid I will fail, because, again, I have failed so many times. When someone asks me to do something that I've done before that I failed, or when someone asks me to do something I've never done before, because I have such a fear of failure and rejection, it creates a feeling of anxiety, and so I just don't do it. And then other people, they just have control issues. They just don't want to be told what to do. They don't want to be told there's a deadline. And so they put it off, and they put it off in a, more so a subconscious way of just trying to be in control. They're frustrated. They don't want to be told what to do. There's compliance. Compliance is where that we just go along on the outside. On the inside, we haven't changed a thing. We're just saying what you want to hear. I'm just doing what you want to hear. Working in corrections, as I said before, there's a lot of compliance there. Working in substance abuse programs, there's a lot of compliance that goes there. Oftentimes, individuals are mandated to go to programs. They're mandated to go to AA and NA meetings or some sort of self-help meeting, and they carry their bodies in there, and they sit down, and they appear to be listening, and they get their paper signed at the end of the meeting that shows that they were there, but they haven't really bought into recovery. They haven't really bought into change. They are just doing it to comply. They're just doing it to go along. They really aren't happy about doing it. In fact, they're very angry about doing it. But they know if they don't comply, that the consequences of not complying are greater than complying. And so they just go through the motions. And there are a lot of people that go through life just going through the motions because they're frustrated. They feel stuck. And then there's what I call defensive behaviors. These are behaviors that we develop because we don't think we can change, but we want to place the blame on someone else. Sometimes when I work with people in programs, they start to get better. And they start to see how that they might succeed. But as they begin to look at the price they're going to have to pay to fully succeed, they either get afraid, or those feelings of rejection, those feelings of failure, and things kick in, and they start overthinking things. And whenever you overthink something, I'll be honest, overthinking never brings you to a positive solution. Overthinking always brings you to a negative solution. And as they overthink and they are reminded of how many times they failed in this program and that program, they get so afraid and they get so angry with themselves that they will act out in a way to get thrown out of the program because they're afraid to succeed. And that way, the manipulation is that way they don't have to tell people that they quit. They can say that Mr. Griffin put me out of the program. They remain a victim, and I become the cause of their failure. I become the cause of their frustration. I become their excuse for not succeeding in life. And I see this happen all the time. And I know this happens, and I have to be careful when I see people starting to make success in the programs that I'm working, that I don't spend some time with them talking about this very issue because they don't know how to deal with that. I work with a lot of men and women over the years, and even adolescents, who have never completed a single thing in their life because as they got close to the completion and the success, they self-sabotaged and they got themselves kicked out, or they just walked away. Third way in which anger can be expressed is what I call control. Now, most people, when I talk about anger, this is what they think I'm talking about. Anger that's used to control. Aggressive expression of anger. It allows you to maintain an attitude of intimidation. It allows you to maintain power over people and situations. It keeps you in a state of fear. The belief system is, I must hurt you before you hurt me. The dominant emotion in this characteristic of control is fear, and the core characteristic is rage. This is what, like I said, most people think anger is. Physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional, mental, and sexual abuse. You see, understand when you put an individual in a position of fear, the more they are afraid, the more they have the need to control. And all of these expressions that I talk about are a means in which people endeavor to control other people. They endeavor to control them physically, verbally abusive, emotionally abusive, mentally abusive, and even sexually abusive. They are aggressive in that way because they're afraid that, if you leave me, one of the most dangerous things in the world is for a woman that's in a domestic violence situation to tell a man, I'm going to leave you and I'm going to take your kids and I'm going to have you locked up because you're being abusive to me. That's a dangerous move. That conversation should never go on face to face between a man and a woman, because when you say that to a man, it produces such fear in him, it's going to cause his control needs to just go wild. And he's physically going to harm you. He's certainly going to verbally abuse you. He's probably already been emotionally and mentally abusing you to keep you in the relationship that is so destructive, and possibly even sexually abusing you. I don't talk a lot about this because most people know a lot about this, but I want to go to my final step, my final method, and that is anger can be used as a motivator. See, I don't try to teach people not to be angry. One reason I don't try to teach people not to be angry is I don't think really you can teach people not to feel anger. You can teach people a better way to express anger, but you can't teach people how not to feel anger, because it's just a natural human emotion. But you can teach people how to express their anger in a positive way and use the energy of anger in order to motivate people and change in people's lives. So I believe anger can be used, expressed as a motivator. It can be the inner energy to initiate change in one's life. It can be the cause for confrontation in relationships. It can be the catalyst for confrontation, forgiveness, and healing. The belief system is, I know things can get better. The dominant emotion for anger used as a motivator is humility. Now, a lot of times when I ask participants, what does humility mean? And they come up with answers like, well, it means you're weak, it means you're soft, and, it means things like that. But literally, the word humility means teachable. A humble man, a humble woman is someone who's teachable. And the core characteristic is restoration. You see, in order for us to make change, we have got to become teachable. We have to be able to allow people to speak into our lives. Over the last 30 years of being involved in counseling and working with people, I have learned a lot of things. I have learned more things from people and watching people and interacting with people than any other thing. I have worked in prisons, and offenders have been my teachers. I have worked with all manners of substance abusers, and they have been my teachers. I have worked in the church world, and they have been my teachers. I have tried to keep an open mind. Some things they have taught me how to do well, and some things they have taught me I don't want to do at all. But when you're humble, and when you're honest, and you're open, and you're willing, you're able to make changes in your life. The core characteristics, restoration. The idea of taking something and bringing it back into its original state. I tell a story about this man in this automobile. It's a 1932 Model A Ford. The man in that picture is my grandfather. His name was George Griffin. My grandfather was a auto mechanic, and my dad was a mechanic as well. And this is the last Model A Ford that we ever restored. And the story goes a little like this. My granddaddy lived in Washington County in Kentucky. He was pastoring a little church there, in a little town called Willisburg. And I love my granddaddy. I'd rather spend time with my granddaddy than anybody on the earth. And I remember one day I was riding in the back of the pickup truck, and we were going down this gravel road, down through Washington County, not far from the church that he pastored. And all of a sudden he pulled the truck to a stop, kind of slid in the gravels a little bit, and he stuck his head out the window and hollered at me in the back, and he said, "Boy," he said, "go up there to that old man's house and ask him what he wants for that old car up there in that field." And I looked up there in that field, and to be honest, I didn't see a car. I saw this shell of a thing. There was weeds growing up and out of it. Didn't have no fenders on it, didn't have any wheels on it, didn't have any glass in the windows. Chickens were using it for an outhouse. I didn't see no car, but, my granddaddy had vision. He saw a car. So back in those days, you did what your granddaddy said, so I jumped out of the car, out of the truck, and I ran up on the porch and knocked on the door, and a few moments passed, and a proverbial, Washington County dairy farmer came to the door, one bib up, one bib down, big chaw tobacco in the side of his jaw, Pepsi bottle in his hand, and he looked me up, and he looked me down, and he said, "What you wantin', boy?" See, everybody knew my name, boy. I said, "My granddaddy wants to know what you want for that old car up there in that cow pasture." The gentleman just kind of looked me up and down again. He spit out across the porch. And he said, "Heck, boy." Not really what he said, but "Heck, boy. It ain't worth a dime. You can have the thing." That's how Granddaddy liked to get them. So I ran back to the truck, and I told Granddaddy, I said, "The man said we can have it." I said, "But we got to get it out." So we went to the house, and we got a trailer, and we went up there, and we loaded it up, and we took it to Louisville, where I lived with my parents, and we had a garage there, and the process of restoring that old car took place. Granddaddy was a engine man. Daddy was a body man, and I was a gopher. I was about 6 years old then. Took about 16 months to restore that old car. Had to get fenders and wheels and seats and glass and lights, and had to get just most everything because it had deteriorated in that cow pasture to almost nothing. Wasn't much but a shell there. But after 16 months, my granddaddy and my daddy worked on that car, and you see what it looked like after 16 months. Bright, shiny, black paint, had black button tuck interior, and most important of all, it had a Uga horn. Everybody knows what an Uga horn is. A Model A is not a Model A without an Uga horn. One day, after it was all done, Granddaddy said to me, he said, "Son," he said, "let's take her for a ride." And so we went out in the garage, and I opened up the garage doors and helped him back it out. And we got in it, and we went down the alley, and we come down the street that we lived on. And back in those days, kids played in the yard, and you know, Model A don't sound like a Lexus. You know, it's got a chugga, 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 chugga sound. You could hear it coming, and the kids would see it, and they would holler, "Mr. Griffin's got a new car. Mr. Griffin's got a new car." And we'd get about halfway the block, and Grandpa, he'd look over at me, and he'd give me the look. And I knew what the look meant. The look meant, push that button for the Uga horn. And I pushed that button for the Uga horn, and Ooga, Ooga. And kids would squeal, and we went on down the street. We went back through the alley, and we come back down the second time. And by that time, parents were out in the yard. I mean, you would have thought it was a parade. Kids were running alongside. Parents were pointing at it. You could hear them say, "Mr. Griffin got a new car. Mr. Griffin got a new car." He let me blow the horn a few more times. We took it back to the garage and shut her down. You know how much a 1932 Model A Ford cost in 1932 off the Ford Detroit line? $499. 1932. This was somewhere around 1962, 3. We went in the house to watch TV. We were one of the only families in the neighborhood that had a 2-TV home. We had one big TV that played the sound, and on top of it sat another TV that played the picture. So we were a 2-TV home back in those days. And we were watching TV. We only had 3 channels there, so it wasn't hard to go through all the channels back in those days. But as we was watching TV with my granddaddy, someone knocked on the door. Granddaddy said, "Boy," said, "go to the door and see who's there." And I said, "Yes, sir." And I got up and I went to the front door, and there stood a man there in a suit, nicely dressed. And I said, "Sir, can I help you?" And he said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Is your granddaddy home?" And I said, "Yes, sir, he is." He said, "Would you mind going and getting him for me?" And I said, "I can." And I went and got my granddaddy, and I said, "There's a man at the door that wants to see you, granddaddy." Back in those days, kids didn't know a lot about their parents' adult business, so as my granddaddy was going to the door, I followed behind him and hid behind the door and listened to the conversation. Man said, "How you doing, Mr. Griffin?" And my granddaddy said, "I'm doing fine." He said, "I understand that you got a new car." They kept calling that thing a new car. I was puzzled. My granddaddy said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Mr. Griffin, would you be interested in selling that old car?" And my granddaddy said, "Could be." What would you be willing to give, sir?" The man stood there for a moment, and he said, "Would you take $15,000? And my granddaddy stood there like he wasn't paying attention. And finally, after a moment or so passed, he said, "Yes, sir." "Would that be a check or would that be cash?" And the man said, I've got a check. And so my granddaddy, he noticed me behind the door, and he said, son, go to the kitchen and get a piece of notebook paper. And my granddaddy and that man sat down that day, and they filled out a bill of sale, and they signed it, and the man gave my granddaddy $15,000. The end. What was that car worth in that cow pasture up on that hill? Not a dime. What was it worth in 1932? $499. What was it worth in 1962? $15,000. I told this story not so long ago, and a man came to me and he said, you know what that car would be worth today, Mr. Griffin? I said, I have no clue. He said it would easily bring $75,000 to $85,000. Understand something. I work with a lot of individuals who a lot of people believe their life is not worth a dime. But this is what I know. Just like you can take old cars and restore them, you can take lives and restore them as well. And those lives restored are worth much more than $45,000 or $85,000. You see, step 2, Alcoholics Anonymous says, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. We can't restore our lives by ourselves. We need a power that's greater than ourselves. That word sanity doesn't mean have anything really to do with insanity. In that step, it has to do with sanitation. What that step literally means is we came to believe that our lives, through a power greater than ourselves, can be restored to the condition it was before you ever found yourself in addiction. It'll restore you back to clean. That's all that I have for this session today. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you very much.